Welcome to another episode of the Scottish Property Podcast. My name's Nick Ponte. I'm here with Stephen Clark. How you doing, Stephen?
How about you, Nick?
Oh, good, thanks. Yeah. So we are touching on sort of news and current affairs. So we've got Shaheena Din on the podcast this week, and she's the National Project Manager for Empty Homes at Shelter Scotland. And it was very interesting, actually, because it's really relevant just now, because we've got all these political parties and the politicians coming out with, we can solve the housing crisis by bringing empty homes back into use. But we get all these stats, and really we like to see the breakdown. So Shaheena gave us the breakdown about there's certain stats that properties have only been empty for 6 months, and we can't really go on those stats. So she gave us a right good insight to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And she told us about the council's empty homes officers. Now, I've dealt with the empty homes officers in Fife and other councils for probably about 10 years since they were kind of introduced. They're really, really good. Some of them have got, well, she's actually said that most of them now have got matchmaker schemes where they try and match make empty homes with investors or developers looking to buy them. They're often not as successful, but it's basically like a dating agency. Here's your empty homes, and we've got investors looking to do it. They send them out regularly once they kind of compile them together. So there could be some opportunities to work with people that work for Shaheena as well to source your next property and help get empty homes back into circulation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what manage people's expectations that this is not going to be like a flood of deals coming to your endless, but it's all about building up relationships. And Shaheena's been kind of tasked with, creating creative solutions to kind of solve this problem. And it was a good chat, and hope you guys get something out of it. We'll just cut to the interview with Shaheena. Okay, welcome to the Scottish Property Podcast, Shaheena Din. How are you today?
Yeah, good, thank you. Just having my cup of tea and getting ready for this podcast. Looking forward to it.
And we didn't give you any notice that you're going to be on YouTube with this as well, but you're looking absolutely fantastic there, so don't worry. Can you just take a brief moment to introduce yourself to listeners? Give us your job title and what you actually do, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Shaheena Din. I'm the National Project Manager for the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, and we are funded by the Scottish Government and hosted by Shelter Scotland. And our key aim is to encourage Scotland's private sector empty homes back into use.
Excellent. Well, I thought it'd be interesting because there's a lot of discussion about this at the moment. It seems to be quite a hot topic in the press about empty homes and how this could solve Scotland's, housing crisis and the shortage of private rented accommodation out there, and how there's so many, empty homes, and all the political parties seem to be using it as a kind of line as well. So I think it'd be good for you to shed a bit of light on this and to really give us a wee insight into what's going on with the empty homes in Scotland. So can you just start off by, giving us an idea of the stats and how many houses are actually sitting empty at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I think it'd probably be useful for you to understand the definition of empty home when I'm giving you some of the stats. So the definition that we use is official Scottish Government definition, which is a home that's been empty for 6 months or more and is liable for council tax. So currently in Scotland, at the last snapshot, because obviously they do a snapshot every September, which is then published around about December or January time. At the last snapshot, there were approximately 43,000 long-term empty homes. And out of these, almost 28,000 had been empty for over 12 months. So the 6 months figure is 43,000, the 12-month figure is about 28,000. And it's interesting to note that out of the 43,000, 51% of these are in 6 councils. So it would be useful to maybe draw a bit of light on those. So we've got Edinburgh with approximately reporting 7,000, Aberdeen reporting 4,000, Glasgow 3.5. These are all rough figures rounded up. Highland approximately 3,200. Aberdeenshire approximately 2,500, and Fife approximately 2,500. So, you can see that there's a broad range of where our empty homes are. They're not just in rural areas or just in our urban centres. They are everywhere.
But those figures sort of tie into the kind of population sizes as well, don't they? In terms of, Edinburgh, Glasgow at the top, then
Absolutely.
sort of
And the
thing.
number of dwellings as well. So the average percentage of empty homes across Scotland, I think, is about 1.6% lying empty.
Hmm.
And some of these will have higher figures and some will be slightly lower percentage wise.
Well, that's interesting as well, because the stat you said about the 6 month, homes are empty,
Mm-hmm.
6 month point, that, you hear politicians and that using these, tens of thousands of empty homes and all the rest of it. But like, really, a house or a property could be lying empty for 6 months just because, it could be a second home. Somebody might not be using it for, their holiday let, or, so the 6 month figure it doesn't really mean much, does it?
I
Maybe
don't think the holiday lets would come into that because that's recorded slightly differently on council tax. But I think the 6 month figure is a good figure to try and, when a council recognises that property's been empty for 6 months or more, they can jump in and say, right, okay, what can we do to proactively bring this home back into use? Because we know that the longer a property lies empty, the harder it is to bring back into use. And you'll know that yourself. Leave your property empty for 1 year over a winter, when you'll start seeing the damp and the condensation,
Mm,
especially with the cold that we've got here. So the 6 month figure is a very much a preventative type of figure, but the 12-month figure probably is one to watch out for,
yeah.
because once they get stuck on that 12-month figure, it seems to be, okay, now what's going on? Whereas the 6 to 12 month might just be a natural churn in the market.
Aye.
Yeah, like people listing their property for sale or to rent or to exit that property. But what's the statistics looking like for properties that have been empty for more than 12 months then?
I mean, we've been roughly around about that 28, 27, 28,000 for the
Okay.
last couple of years. What we would ideally like to know is how long those have been empty for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years plus, that type of thing. But we unfortunately don't have a breakdown of those at the moment. It's something that we're looking to improve
Mm.
in terms of the quality of data that we get.
So when a property's been like identified as being empty for 6 months, at that point, what are the councils doing, or what are the empty home officers doing at that
So
point? What's the process?
So just to be mindful that there's usually one empty homes officer dealing with about 2,000 empty properties in their local authority area. So I suppose
Yeah.
some councils have more than one, but generally that's what it is. And so they do write out to owners of empty properties. They will send out a letter saying, look, there's advice and information. Sometimes they do like marketing drives to say, look, if you are an owner of an empty property, contact us. But I think the main thing that triggers is once the property is empty for 12 months or more, a council can then charge double council tax on that
Mm.
property. And so you're, instead of the 100% council tax, you're going to be hit with 200%. And I think empty homes officers will try and often use that to say, listen, we know this is coming, but we can try and prevent this.
I
Right.
think
Okay.
this is how you're incentivizing people to not have empty homes, because this is quite a new thing in the last few years, isn't it? By not giving allowance on empty homes and charging 200% on properties that have been
Yeah,
empty for
I
more than a year.
think the vacant dwelling council tax levy was introduced back in 2013. And it took a while for councils to come on board and all of them to start charging it. And I think it's only 30 councils now that are charging the vacant dwelling council tax levy. And it's meant to be, the spirit of that legislation is to unlock empty homes. So it's meant to be used with a discretion, basically. So councils can say to an owner, listen, if you're taking steps to bring that empty property back into use, we won't charge you that. And, it's a sort of a leverage, but not all councils use it that way.
Yeah, I buy properties in different council areas, and it is so frustrating because you're not getting one size fits all. You're not getting
No,
everyone
absolutely
following
not.
the same rules. The current property that I'm sitting in right now is it was a housing association that owned it and had it on the market for 4 or 5 years trying to sell it. I just got word back from Aberdeen City Council like literally a couple of days ago saying because it was empty for 6 months previous and the lease being used, I'm getting 50% relief, but there's 7 4-bedroom flats in this building. So I've just now been hit with thousands of pounds by me spending £200,000 trying to get these properties back into circulation. I'm getting penalised as well as an investor. And I sent over pictures of the properties that were stripped out, no kitchens, no bathrooms, roof leaks. Here's what we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is not habitable. And okay, we can't give you 100% relief, but we'll give you 50%. I think, and that's not quite good enough if someone's making a huge conscious effort to get them back into circulation.
Well,
Yeah.
on that point, then, Shaheena, what do you think, or do you think that councils could be doing anything to work with investors, developers, to obviously, would there be some more incentives that they could give to us to obviously get involved in the process of bringing empty buildings back into use?
So different councils do things differently. You've just said that yourself. You've had a very different response from a different council, and actually, I wouldn't knock any councils because they all have good and bad policies in equal measure. So some of them do things very well, but I think there's certain things that could be replicable that are very useful for bringing empty homes back into use. So, for example, Perth and Kinross have got the Empty Homes Grants Initiative, where if you buy an empty property and you bring it back into social housing for a minimum period of time, I think it's 5 years, they'll give you, is it £7,500 per bedroom to renovate it? So, I mean, those types of things are really useful because I suppose from my perspective, obviously, I'm employed by Shelter Scotland. We want to see the increase of social homes because we recognise that that is the best way to solve the housing emergency. And to increase the supply of social homes, then we need to look at our private sector empty homes and think about how we can incentivise those as well to be brought back as social housing.
Or increase the private rental sector demand where it takes the pressure off the social sector, surely.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, every empty home has been a home for someone in the past, and when it's brought back into use, certainly it's a home for someone else in the private rented sector that perhaps wouldn't be eligible for social housing. So definitely it works. It's a full circle, isn't it? There's all the different options.
So if you're mainly focused on obviously the social, social sector and social landlords and stuff like that, why have you got a section on your website that says investors and developers? And are there any opportunities to work with you from the private point of view then?
I mean, we're not mainly focused on social housing. We would prefer empty homes to be brought back into social housing where possible, but our remit from the Scottish Government is to bring empty homes back into use. And we recognise that it's not just social landlords that can do that. What I would say to investors and developers is that there are limited matchmaker schemes across Scotland.
Can you just explain what that is, the matchmaker
Absolutely.
scheme?
So it's almost like a little bit of a dating agency where you have, on the one hand, you've got properties and investors, and on the other hand, you've got empty homeowners. And the premise behind that was to try and link the two things together and bring owners and matchmaker schemes to get, owners of empty properties and investors and developers together. But what we've noticed is that there seems to be a lot of investors on the property lists and hardly any owners, because there seems to be some sort of reticence from owners of empty properties. And I think that's to do with a number of different factors. So I think we need to understand why homes remain empty in the first place. So owners of a property often leave it empty, even though they know that they will be aware that it's costing them money. They will be aware, that it's going into ruin, rack and ruin, but often out of sight, out of mind. Owners can often feel overwhelmed with the thought of dealing with that empty property. Sometimes there's a huge sentimental attachment to a property that they've perhaps inherited, and they may have buried their head in the sand. So when you're trying to go to an owner and you're at that point of saying, but there's somebody there that could just buy your property and bring it back into use, they're not quite in that headspace yet. And I think that's where empty homes officers really have to do some of the groundwork of understanding the owner's individual circumstances, why they are where they are, and then trying to bring the two things together. But I think there's also a perception that owners have of developers as well. Oh, well, they're those nasty ones that perhaps will want to knock me down on price and take the cheapest, and they may have an unrealistic expectation of what their property is worth. And
I know
there's
all
all
about
those
that. I
sort of
get
things.
that daily on social media. I get landlord hate. I get property hate. So, like, I know exactly what you're talking about. People.
You mentioned the matchmaker scheme there, and I've used the matchmaker scheme with the Fife Council for a number of
Lovely.
years, and it's
Yeah.
and it is really good, and they do make a real effort to try and matchmake it. And I have purchased one or two, I think, from the scheme, but it's never went directly through the scheme. It's like you say, they've just not managed to pair them together, not quite ready to give it to an investor that's matched to the scheme. But eventually they've came back and actually then engaged back out, because the beauty of the scheme is, for those who don't know, is they'll give you like a little package of, here's the property, where it's listed on the market, it's got a home report, and they'll give you the seller's contact details, so you can pick up the phone the seller, or email the seller. And the twice that I've made purchases has been when the sellers now came back to me a year or two later, and I don't know if that information gets fed back to the councils, because I obviously never fed back and said,
Yeah.
"Oh, that purchase went through," but that was obviously a result of the empty home scheme.
And
Uh,
that's interesting to note, because you say a year or two later, and that's what I'm saying to you, that the owner's not often in that headspace. And
yeah,
then they come to that realization after, that it's a lot of cajoling, a lot of hand holding, a lot of really saying to an owner, look, these are your options. And these are your only options. And actually, it's actually not good enough to leave a home lying empty.
yeah. How is the owners, I mean, penalised for like the council tax and stuff, for instance? Because I mean, the couple of times that I found properties that have really matched my criteria, and the situations were quite often they inherited the property and they were lived abroad, so they didn't really care. It was something they didn't expect. They weren't just motivated to just push on and get it sold. And I wondered if the council was chasing them for a few £100 a month every month for council tax, and this liability was increasing, they would soon maybe change their mind. But I wondered, if is it something that just gets sent out to the property's address and not the correspondent owner's address, and then they don't know that they've got this liability building up? But how does that work?
So again, it's a mixture, because sometimes council tax have the wrong details for the person who owns the property, right? And it's only when because it's nobody's eyes are on it in terms of who's got liability for it until the empty homes officer comes along, or council tax are doing some sort of cleansing or whatever. So the empty homes officer has to go away and look, and then it's often a bit of investigative work, like who is this owner? Do we have any other details on any of our other council's tax systems, or is there anything else that we can do? Can we check the registers of Scotland? Sometimes they're really old properties and they're all on the old Scenes register, so it can be quite difficult. And so one officer has so many cases that it's difficult to say, right, well, I'm going to do all of those ones. And they do unlock some of them, but they just don't have capacity or resource to do them all.
I helped with an empty homes officer probably about 10 years ago to trace one down. I think it was when the empty homes officer first came to Fife Council, didn't have the resources to take on all these challenges. So I'd got a private investigator, like I'd kind of got like
Yeah,
someone that was my solicitor, to then track down the owner and go through the title. But it changed, the last changed hands in 1948, and the person died 20 odd years ago. The property was
yeah,
laid empty. And then we traced them down to, like, I think it was Canada or New Zealand, but when they contacted them, they're just like, "Oh, we never knew we had it," and stuff like that. And they were in no obligation to sell. And so I'm wondering, in situations like this, which I'm assuming is quite common, that is there any forced compulsory purchase the council or the empty homes department can put on the owners to sell the property?
I mean, yes. So it's tricky. Okay, so first of all, you have to understand where the owner is, and you have to recognize that you've made all the necessary inquiries, and you've gone down the right routes to try and get the owner. And sometimes empty homes officers have agreements in place with genealogists who can help trace the owners, which is kind of sounds like what you can do. But in terms of enforcement action, so obviously you've got council tax, and that's racking up onto the property, and often that will, once the property is sold, that triggers the payment of council tax, because they come down in the pecking order of being paid. But there is compulsory purchase order, and shall I explain that a little bit? So
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure.
yeah, so compulsory purchase order is where the council can forcibly purchase the property from the owner. But if the council doesn't have their own stock, or it's not within their own housing area, what are they going to do with that? So they have to have an agreement in place, which is potentially a back-to-back agreement, usually with a social housing provider, to actually take over that property. But it's really compulsory purchase orders underpinned by very old legislation, and it's complex and it's lengthy. And the Scottish Government have taken some measures to try and make that process quicker and more streamlined. But I do understand that CPO reform, CPO is the shortened version of compulsory purchase order, CPO reform is underway, and they are looking to do that. But the huge thing about this is, the owner has an obligation to keep a property in good standard. And often these properties are causing blight on the community. And the council are thinking, well, if we take on this property, what are we going to do with it? And so there's a reluctance for the councils often to do CPO, A, because they don't know what they're going to do with the property, but B, they have to, once the owner comes up, they have to give the owner market value for it, and full market value for a property that the owner's allowed to rot. So what we've been calling on for the Scottish Government to do is put in place compulsory sale order legislation, and that just pushes the property to market. And then whatever goes to market is what the owner will get. And a sort of halfway in between compulsory purchase and compulsory sale order is a compulsory rental order. So if the council think, actually, this is in an area where we've got really high demand for social housing, they could forcibly take that property, rent it out, carry out the repairs, and take that off the market value. And at the end, after 5 years or so in social housing, because it's only a thought out proposal at the moment, the property could go back, and it would ensure that properties are not left to fall into rack and ruin.
And is this where you come in then? Is this where you've been brought in to kind of like come up with the solutions then?
Yeah, I suppose we've come up with, so we've got 5 clear objectives from the Scottish Government. Our first objective is to make sure that councils have empty homes officers, because without an empty homes officer, nothing can really happen within that local authority. The second thing is to allow councils to sort of mainstream empty homes work. And what I mean by that is they're taking a good strategic overview, so they understand that our empty properties are in this area and actually they're of this type. So we have lots of 2 bedrooms, for example, and there's a demand for 1 bedroom properties. So what are we going to do with this glut of empty properties? That type of thing. So mainstreaming empty homes work. We also provide consultancy, training, workshops to the empty homes officers across councils. So we, try and support them with that.
It seems like there's no consistency though across all the councils. So is this not a better place to bring it all into one place? Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, for you to manage it all. Like you were talking about the sales. So instead of the council doing the compulsory purchase orders, you were talking about the compulsory sale order. Could you not work in collaboration with, like, I don't know, an auction company or something like that? Everything goes on the one portal. You're getting the best possible price for it. Like what other things can you come up with to try and make this process a lot quicker? Because sometimes I just feel like with the council, you just go round circles with them. They don't have the resources. They're understaffed. Things don't get followed through. Like in this day and age, everything should be there on a portal for people to access.
Yeah, and it sounds like a real ideal type world, but we live in a political system and a system of local authorities, and and that's where responsibility is devolved down to local authority, so that they can make local level decisions and use their local intelligence to inform their priorities and their strategies. And it's not for me to determine how they do that. The only thing.
But what else do you want to see getting done? You're obviously spearheading this whole thing. You're at the front of it.
Well, I want every local authority to have at least more than 1 empty homes officer where there is a requirement for more than 1 empty homes officer. I want every local authority to have a clear empty home strategy, which not only works with the owners of empty properties, but will reach out to developers and investors like yourselves that are thinking about what we want to do. I want them to think about the basket of measures that they can introduce to encourage empty homes to be brought back into use, whether that's loans and grants, whether that is discretion on council tax, whether that is use of CPO, thinking about all the different tools that they currently have already. But I also want owners of empty properties to really recognise that it's not okay to leave homes empty. We're in a housing emergency. We need all the homes that we can get. And while I get that there are, life circumstances behind leaving a home empty, it's not all right.
You mentioned a couple of times as well about trying to understand why people are keeping homes empty. And the last few times that I've been sent like the 5 council list for the matchmaker scheme, the same properties appear, and from an investor developer. And we all want the same thing. And this is where I think that's going to become political is it doesn't serve no one if all these homes are empty. Like no one it's going to put a pressure on all the sectors. But all the same properties that came through, like the Fife Council, for instance, is a clear example. It's always a lower end value property. So it never ever suits an owner occupier. So put on open market, you're probably not finding that most people are going to buy a 40, 50,000, 60,000 pound flat anymore. You know, that is a clearly a private rental sector property or a social housing rental sector property. But what they're doing is most of them that came through, they've got a home report value. They've obviously valued them. They've put them. A lot of them have been put on the market. They're showing you the link, but no one's buying them because they're incentivized to an investor. But now you've got the Scottish government, on the other hand, charging private rental sector, penalising the private rental sector completely. They're then putting your 4% tax, raising it to 6% immediately. If you look at these properties, for you to exit these properties, if these properties, the owner wants them sold and they want them sold at market value, penalising the people that can actually buy them by getting them to pay 6% more tax, we're never going to solve that problem. So is it like the left hand's not speaking to the right hand? You've got this role in place, but politically they're not helping you do your job.
Yeah, I think we need to recognise that rents are rocketing sky high, housing costs are unaffordable for so many people, and people are struggling within a cost of living crisis. So I think what we're trying, I mean, from Shelter Scotland's perspective, we need the Scottish Government to meet their commitment of building enough social homes. And how they do that, whether it's buying back empty properties and bringing them back into social housing, or building the social homes, that's what we need. In terms of private landlords and investment, I suppose that's not really for me to comment on, and from my particular perspective. But
let me give you another example then, like real time example. So there's a huge housing shortage for a property type in a certain area in Fife, which I have. I'm trying to evict my tenant because my personal name will be hit by personal government taxes that I don't get the interest relief on my mortgage. So it's time for me to exit this property. The tenant can't leave the property because there's no social housing stock. They're on a waiting list. So the council tell them, don't leave because you'll be homeless, basically. And I'm contacting the council. I've spoken to the person I know well at the council and says, buy my house. It's market value. I've heard you're buying them back at market value. You're buying stock. And it's just, there's no communication. There's a solution. People are willing to sell them back to you. You won't sell them. They've got the stock you need. There's no linking them together at all.
Yeah, and I guess that's where I mean, I can't comment on that case, but I guess in terms of when I'm calling for a strategic approach, that's what I mean. It needs to be thought about strategically, and it needs to make sure that different stakeholders are speaking to each other, and that we're meeting the demands of our housing, that we have in Scotland. And obviously, I don't know what's happened in Fife, but maybe that doesn't meet their strategic housing investment plan, or I have no idea why they're reluctant, but whatever it is, there's something there.
Do you know how many councils are operating the matchmaker scheme?
I think most of them are, actually. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I can check with my colleague, though. Just give me 1 second.
That's all right. It's fine. I mean, most of them, that's fine. The thing that, pulling it back to the empty homes, right? We see a lot in the press at the moment. I think it was Anna Salver of the Scottish Labour came out and said that he, if Labour got into power, then they would sell off empty homes at £1, to people that were first-time buyers and all the rest of it. So, there's a lot of political statements going out there about home ownership, and empty homes should be offered to first-time buyers for sale to set up homes and all that. But you're coming from a different angle. You're wanting them to go back into social housing and that. So how would you manage that then if Labour?
I mean, I want to bring them back into use, regardless of social housing or not. I would just prefer them to be brought back in for social housing. However, I'd prefer it to be back into use than lying empty. So be clear about that. In terms of the £1 home scheme, I'll give you a little bit of context around what Liverpool did, because I think that's where it's been modelled from. Yeah. So the national government at the time had taken ownership. It was almost, I think it was a CPO scheme in Liverpool, where they'd compulsory purchased all these properties because they were going to make these properties, they were going to demolish these communities. And then I think the government then pulled funding for demolishing it. And actually, the local authority was then left with all of these empty homes. So these empty homes were now in local authority ownership. They weren't privately owned.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't understand how we go from privately owned empty homes to a £1 empty home scheme, because then that would mean more compulsory purchase orders. And then I explained to you the lengthy process and the cost, and the sort of reluctance that local authorities have to do compulsory purchase orders. So unless there's significant shake-up in terms of legislation, or I don't understand how that would work in practice or how it would be practical. So no, I don't.
Can you give us an idea of the kind of like, the, I mean, I think you said right at the start, all the areas are very different, and the types of homes and all the rest of it. But Stephen touched on like, are a lot of the properties in sort of deprived areas, that are kind of like, values would be under £60,000 or something like that, or
No, I don't think they are actually. You'll get a real mismatch in housing supply. So in some areas you'll get really old, large, derelict properties,
yeah,
that people can't that are really expensive to renovate and bring back into use, at new standards that we want to introduce in Scotland. So um, yeah, you've got all the really high-end properties, really
yeah,
expensive, old, and then you've got there's just a mixture of everything. There's one down the road from where I live actually at the moment, but I'm really grateful to see it's being brought back into use.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, they're just
Yeah.
everywhere, and when
Yeah,
you start working in this, you walk around and you see them.
yeah. And in terms of owners as well, like, do you find that a lot of maybe landlords now who can't afford to bring the properties up to standard because the government are obviously introducing more tougher repairing standards, and obviously, how do you think this is going to play out as well with EPC regulations coming in the short, you know, only in the next couple of years? All rental properties have got to be minimum C. So could this have a greater impact on empty homes coming at this new EPC minimum requirements era as well?
I mean, something I would love to see is some sort of incentive from the Scottish Government to actually bring an empty property, to retrofit an empty property, because it actually makes sense. The
Yeah.
property is empty. That is the time to do sort of renovation or work, because that's when you can get in, you're not disturbing anybody, and you're already likely doing refurbishment work. So to retrofit it and bring it up to a higher standard is not going to be significantly more. And I think there should be some sort of incentive, grants or loans or something available to encourage that. But I recognise that there's not, and that's
Yeah,
my
I like
ideal
that one you
world.
mentioned on the Perth and Kinrossy. That's quite interesting. I hadn't heard of that before.
Yeah, it's called the Empty Property Initiative, and it is they match it to their PKC let, so they've got their own letting agent as well, and they match it to people that are on their waiting lists, and so the rent's all guaranteed. They do the rent deposit guarantee scheme and everything. It's a really nice cohesive way of working, but again, there's only so much money, so much pots, and everybody's trying to fix certain things.
See, that's where the kind of thing is, and Stephen sees it as well. Like that, you know, you're dealing with governments, right? And you're having meetings, and you're just said there's only so much money, and we can't get enough money and the rest of it. But me and Stephen are looking at it from the private investor side, and like Stephen goes out there and raises loads of money, and there's he probably said there's no shortage of money out there coming from the private end. Do you know what I mean? So there is money there, but so that's where the question is: why is there not a greater collaboration with the private sector? Because the money is there. There's loads of people that would invest.
Yeah, and I think perhaps we need to think about what we want for Scotland's long-term housing strategy. I don't know if you've looked at Housing to 2040 and the long-term vision for Scotland, but I suppose some of that is making sure that we've got an affordable, safe and secure warm home for people in the places that they want to live.
Mm-hmm.
And it's thinking about, if we're looking at where people are at the moment right now, rocketing rent prices. You can't get onto a property ladder. You can't get a property to rent. You're often, depending on the areas that you're obviously looking at, and it's very difficult. And I think that's where we continuously call for more social homes, because I think that is the key to the housing emergency. And it just means that people that want to stay in the private rented sector can stay, but
Only
where
one
it's not
section of it.
suitable for them, there is a social home for them to go to.
Yeah, and it's only one section. We had a market update with a couple of agents from Glasgow last week, and they were sharing statistics that there's so many. Well, do you remember the statistics that the Marshana was sharing about how many properties were going onto the market from the rental sector where people were just getting out? So you've already got this huge shortage, and now the government's forcing the private rental sector to people to exit, which is only going to put more pressure in rather than trying to work together. It's like we'll penalise that section and we'll focus on that section. But the social section has never been performing and never been meeting targets for so many years. So why do they think they can do it now? By alienating the other side of it.
Yeah, again, I suppose I can't really comment on what the government's doing in terms of with private landlords, or that's a conversation between the Scottish government and private landlords. What I could say though is
We've
there
tried to
are
get them on the podcast 17 times. They won't come on the podcast and have a chat, have a conversation.
I think what's really interesting, I don't know if any of you have heard of Homes for Good. So
Yeah. Susan
they're doing,
Actimell's actually been a guest on the podcast.
so they're doing things differently. And I think we need more of that. So where, she's really providing homes for people that are on low incomes, and they are actually really lovely homes. And there's that, that tenancy support and all the different things that you would expect from social housing is involved with what Homes for Good are doing. And I think, she comes under as a social enterprise, and
Well, I think
more
you
of
would,
those types of things are
and
needed.
Susan is a great example, right? And what they do there is great. But I think you'd be surprised at how many landlords do actually care, and we're not all just like, money grabbing, greedy fat cats. Do you know what I mean? Like the stuff that I do for my tenants, is probably a heck of a lot more than what most councils and social landlords would do. Do you know what I mean? So I think there is a real bad perception out there in the public about landlords and investors, because you can see in the background as well, Stephen's sitting in a building there. You can see the standard of it, that he's, done that building up to a really good standard. He cares about the product that he is producing as well,
Yeah,
So
and absolutely. And I suppose home's everything. It's the foundation on which we build our lives. And everybody knows that it's one of the most basic human needs for everyone. And so, you know, um, yeah, and that's what we campaign for. We campaign for people to have a safe, secure, affordable home.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
okay, well, Shaheena, that's been brilliant. Thanks very much for
No
coming on
worries.
here. Sorry to try and drag you into the politics. I know that's not your domain, but obviously, look forward to seeing how you progress, and obviously, all your creative strategies that you're going to come up with to obviously sort this issue out and get more homes back into use.
And if there's anything we can do on the Scottish Property Podcast to help, please let us know, and we can send out to our listeners as well and our mailing lists.
I mean, I think one of the things that we'll be definitely looking to do is review the matchmaker scheme. And I think that we need to understand how we can do that better. And yeah, your voices will be interesting to, capture those as well. So we will reach out to you at some point
Great.
whenever we get a chance within our busy year.
And next time you're invited into the Scottish Parliament, if you can grab Patrick Harvey for us and ask him to come on the Scottish Property Podcast, that would be great. Fantastic.
Right,
Thanks very much, Shaheena, and we'll send you a wee link and put your is it a website you want us to share? emptyhomespartnership.scot. Is that the
yeah,
right one?
that's it. That's the one. Yeah. And also, if anybody wants to call, report, or talk about an empty home, it's emptyhomespartnership.scot as well. We've got an advice service where they can report an empty home.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
So, guys, hope you enjoyed that episode. As always, give us a wee follow on our social media channels, subscribe to the podcast, take a screenshot and tag us in your Instagram, and get across to our networking event, Stephen.
Absolutely, guys. We'll see you at the networking events. They're in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Dundee on the first Wednesday of every month. we've got our hosts are brilliant, and they bring in fantastic guest speakers to share value, market updates in their area, and network with like-minded people.
Brilliant. Bye for now.
See you guys.